everyone, and welcome all ANZSOM members and our AFOM guests as we talk tonight about transitioning to telehealth. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Dominic Yong. I'm an occupational physician from Melbourne and also the incoming president of ANZSOM. Now, we're talking about telehealth, and if you asked me 2 months ago about telehealth, I really wouldn't have had a clue about this topic. I didn't practice telehealth, but in that time, it's certainly part of my practice. So what I thought I'd do firstly, before we get onto the panelists, is just to share my experiences of COVID and what's happened 2 months ago and how it's changed the practice to now. So if you look at the first slide is where I work. It's the Coolaroo Clinic. This is just a standard medical clinic. It's full of, it's got some physicians, GPs, surgeons, allied health professionals. And 2 months ago, we're happily just doing our own business in the industry. Now, if you look at what's happened with COVID and how it's now changed, on the left photograph, you can now see that to get into the clinic, you have to stand in a queue, and you can see the black crosses, and that's how we queue in a socially distanced world. In the middle photo, once you make it to reception, you go through a screening process. And so one of our staff members will ask you a few questions about whether you have respiratory symptoms, will ask you about travel or contact with COVID, and take your temperature. So if you answer your questions correctly and you're afebrile, you'll be invited to sit in the waiting room. And the last photograph on the right is a picture of one of my colleagues. We're now wearing scrubs, so we're not wearing our shirt, pants, jackets anymore for infection control reasons. On the table, you can see there's a couple of screens, and one of the screens, the desktop, is doing our standard clinical software package, and the laptop is now set up for telehealth. And this is something which, as you're probably aware, in the middle of March, the Department of Health, through the Australian government, created telehealth item numbers for us as doctors to do treatment through the Medicare system, as well as through the workers' compensation and TAC system. And that's now progressed into the independent medical examination field, where we are starting to do these sort of services. Now, at the time when it came in, I knew nothing, and I was on the learning curve from a very, very low base. And I figured that, well, probably everyone else is in the same boat, and hence this is why we've created this topic. And really, on behalf of ANZSOM, we're absolutely delighted to be partnering with MEDirect to be running this session on telehealth. MEDirect is an IT and tech company. They have IME, or sort of a medico-legal practice management software, which sort of links IME providers and IME referrers. And I'm going to introduce to you the facilitator for tonight, who's a director at MEDirect, Sue Larson, and she'll introduce the panelists and we'll run the session. So I'll hand over to you, Sue.
Thanks so much, Dominic. So I think it's fair to say that, Dominic, as much as you've experienced some massive change over the last 3 to 4 weeks as a result of COVID-19, so too all of us have experienced a massive change in how we work. And that's caused many medico-legal assessors to consider, well, how should they make the transition to telehealth? What strategies are others using to help them make determinations in the absence of physical examinations? And also whether impairment assessments can actually feasibly and reliably even be undertaken without the physical laying on of hands. So from the outset, I'd like to acknowledge the view of the panel and myself, which is that face-to-face consults are of course the gold standard, and understandably there are limitations associated with video conference assessments. But what we know is that the personal injury sector isn't stopping. So we now need to look at what can be done and how it can be done, to share ideas and to learn from each other. And so to get us started tonight, I'd like us all to consider 2 quotes. The first is this: every adversity brings with it the seed of an equivalent advantage. And the second, the day that you plant the seed is not the day that you eat the fruit. And I think it's fair to say that we're still really at the seed stage. I know a lot has happened in the last 3 to 4 weeks. And as you said, Dominic, you know, who would have ever thought, you know, 4 weeks ago that we'd be doing these kinds of assessment on a semi-regular basis. But over the next 6 months, the personal injury sector, I'm sure, will become so much stronger in its expertise in delivering video conferenced assessments. So to help us plant and water the seeds tonight, I have a wonderful panel who are going to share their experiences so far and their perspectives on making the transition to telehealth. So let me introduce them to you. We have firstly Dr. Greg Cameron, occupational medicine practitioner, IMC, and Chief Medical Officer at MEDirect. We have Karina Nichols, who is a solicitor at Coots Legal and has over 15 years experience and knowledge in all areas of injury compensation and employment law. We have Dr. Ralph Pockenbeek, an occupational physician from Victoria, who's been doing medico-legals for many, many years. And of course we have Dominic, who you all know and love, and the President-elect of ANZSOM. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being here tonight. Now, I'd like to say from the outset and just give a heads up that we've had such a strong response to this webinar tonight. And while our intention was to run the webinar for 1 hour, we received so many questions in advance, and we will no doubt be receiving quite a lot of questions live coming in. And so rather than not do the questions justice, we've decided to extend the webinar. It will likely run to about 1.5 hours. If you do need to leave, of course, please feel free, but we wanted to make sure that we answered all the questions to a reasonable capacity. We know that there will be some questions that come in as well live on the panel, live through your control panel that you'll see on your screens. We will stop periodically throughout this webinar to answer questions as they come in, and should there be questions that we're unable to answer, we will respond to those over the coming days. But tonight, these are the things that we're going to be looking at. What are the current expectations from the regulators, from the courts? What are the expectations around how to conduct video conference assessments or actually medico-legal consults? We're going to be looking at setting the consultation up for success. So what are some of the things you could be doing in advance to help you get the best outcome possible from a video conference telehealth assessment? How do you actually conduct examinations via video conferencing? Can impairment assessments really be done? Can they be relied upon? And that's one of the big questions for tonight. We're going to be looking at security and video conferencing platforms, and we're going to be looking at some additional initiatives and some resources that can help you beyond this webinar. So let's get into this without further ado, and let's start with the very first question. And that question is going to be directed firstly to Dominic, and then we're going to be getting some perspectives from Greg, and then from a legal perspective from Karina Nichols. So the question is, and this is one that's been submitted tonight by an ANZSOM member, it is that there's been a lot of uncertainty about what is expected of medico-legal experts in the current environment. So what is it? What are the instructions that are being received currently to date? And you know, what is the expectations from the regulators, the tribunals, and the courts? So Dominic, could I throw to you first, please?
Yeah, sure. So again, I work in Victoria, so I'll tell you about our jurisdiction. On the 25th of March, we were all sent an email from WorkSafe saying that they've created temporary item numbers for telehealth IME consults. They did say that this is the worker's preference, but it would also be expanded to also practitioners who potentially feel they are vulnerable, or may even live with family members who are vulnerable. So certainly you can do telehealth for the IME. I did have a chat with one of our colleagues, an ANZSOM member, an AFO member, who is a medical advisor for WorkSafe, and he sort of agreed that was the case. They did say they are trying to do less IMEs, but certainly if you do an IME, telehealth is certainly an option. In addition, one of my other roles is I'm a presiding member of the medical panels, which is a dispute resolution tribunal in Victoria. The medical panels around the same time, end of March, disbanded and they closed indefinitely. They've recently reopened for just psych panels doing telehealth consultations as a trial. And most likely for the physical panels, there will be a combination of a telehealth consult and a limited physical exam wearing the PPE. So I'm guessing sort of all the masks and everything. So that's from a Victorian perspective.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. Greg, you're New South Wales based and do a lot of work within the workers' comp and the motor vehicle arenas. What's been your experience in the last few weeks in this state and these schemes?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Yeah, well, Sarah's basically done similar to what Dominic just described in New South Wales. I think the message is keep going. You know, whatever you, as much as possible, do them via telehealth. If you absolutely have to do them, and I'm still doing a few face-to-face because some of the insurers are really forcing it, but as much as possible, yeah, we're doing them via telehealth.
Okay, thanks for that, Greg. And Karina, from a legal perspective, what are the courts saying? And I'd also love you to comment on the feedback that has been received from Sarah, particularly regarding the DRS. So firstly, the courts, and then Sarah, please.
So basically the indication we've got from the courts and tribunals is that we are to continue doing what we're doing. Obviously, there are some challenges with that, but the goal is to keep continuing the claims and the rights to workers and employers, making sure that the cases are moving along to meet the guidelines. So the goal is to continue. The recent notification from CIRA in relation to DRS initially was it was to be suspended in terms of face-to-face. They've now moved into where there's special circumstances, they would allow a face-to-face, but there's a whole heap of things that need to be tested before you get to that. So if you can do it via telehealth and the parties agree to that, then that is the first point of call.
Okay, so what we seem to be hearing across the board is that face-to-face engagement or face-to-face assessments are to be minimised, and assuming that all parties are happy to go ahead and feel that they can confidently and competently carry out an assessment, then that is the preferred approach to take. Okay, we're going to start to look now at some of the experiences that each of you have had. And I just want to put a call out to all of the participants who are on the line as well. As questions come up, please feel free to submit them in the questions box. You'll find this on your control panel, and you can submit any questions. We will be stopping throughout the webinar tonight, and we'll be answering specific questions. So I'm going to start, Ralph, with you. You've conducted a number of assessments via video conferencing over the last 3 to 4 weeks. And over that time, you've learnt firsthand about what things do and don't work and how to ensure that you're getting the best possible outcomes from the consultation. So we're looking specifically now at the physical environment and setting the consult up for success. Not so much around the clinical examination. We're going to be spending quite a lot of time liaising with the panelists around different things that they do to get to come to the clinical determination from the examination perspective. But there are also a lot of considerations before you actually host the consultation via video conferencing, and things that can make a big difference in terms of the success of the outcome. Ralph, what's your experience been to date?
Yeah. I've had a fairly varied experience of seeing people using their phone at home, and also seeing people in the boardroom of a company for fitness for duty assessment. That was quite difficult, and a kind of a walk through worksite, which is a virtual worksite, of course, with its obvious limitations. I think the important thing, apart from setting up a secure and appropriate platform for communication with the patient, which I won't talk much about because I'm not an expert on that. But the main thing that I find that's very necessary in this circumstance, whenever you're doing an IME, you've got to be pleasant and outgoing and make the person feel comfortable. But in this circumstance, you've got to really ramp that up, because it's daunting enough for us. Imagine what it's like for the patient. They're used to coming to see you in a neutral ground, which is your office. Now you're seeing them in their home. It's kind of an intrusion. You've got to accept that and try to talk to people, make them feel comfortable, find out where they are, how they're coping with the shutdown and all that kind of stuff. Explain in detail what's required in the assessment, what you're planning on doing, why you're doing it, the protocol you're going to be following, and also the limitations. Now, it's probably also worthwhile finding out if there's anybody else in the room, because you need to document that and acknowledge that they're there. I won't go into the examination part as yet. You've got to sort of set people up to do the lighting and so on. I've had a lot of difficulty in my untidy room tonight, setting things up so that you tend to look reasonably good. You know, you've got to really have some situation and give time for the person setting themselves up properly. You've got to take a very, very detailed history, far more than you normally would, because I think one of the things you've got to accept is that we make our assessment based on evidence, which Karina's probably far more familiar with than the rest of us. And without being able to do a full physical examination, the amount of data you're using is limited. And you've got to try and compensate for that by taking a more detailed history than you would. In particular, a very detailed history of what the person does at work, how long they've been doing it, how the injury developed, which is important in terms of liability, and then the development of the treatment, where they're at the moment. I find a good thing to ask people when you're trying to assess their work capacity is to say to them, look, you know your job far better than anybody else. Do you think you can do it? And if you can, what sort of restrictions are needed? And if you can't, why don't you think you can do it? So those kinds of things are important. Setting up the person properly can be troublesome as well. I saw a couple of people in the boardroom of a large company that I do a consultancy to. Now that was difficult because the camera was placed on the computer up on the wall on the screen, at the top of the wall, pointing down at the patient, and the microphone was in the middle of the boardroom. So you had the choice of either seeing the person or hearing them. Mostly it was important to hear them. And then you had to get them to come into focus of the camera so I could do as best I could with the examination. Now, that worked out well with goodwill on the part of both the examiner and the examinee. Unless you establish that goodwill, it's not going to work. The impairment assessments is one that comes up quite a lot, and I noticed a question in the chat thing recently. I think you got to say, try and use DRE as much as you can, and that's generally the preferred method anyhow. With measuring ranges of movement, there are apps you can use to do the goniometer type measurements. I just wonder how legally reasonable that is, because you're still making an estimate, and you're not meant to be making an estimate when you're doing an impairment assessment. So I think there are problems there. But in terms of doing a normal assessment, it can be done if you take a detailed history. I hope I'm not rambling on too much.
I think let's go into detail about particularly range of motion and impairments as we progress through the webinar.
Yeah, sure. I won't touch on that.
I think there's going to be a lot of conversation about actually examinations. It's very much why I think most people are here tonight.
Yeah,
so I would love to pick everyone's brains about that. But I think as well, what I've heard from you so far, and I'd love to get Greg's opinion on this as well, because he's done a lot of this kind of work via video conferencing, is there's a lot of thought that's required in the setup prior to think about, well, what is the assessment and what am I going to need, because I'm going to have to communicate this ahead of time. And certainly, Greg, I know in your experience, you've had people on all manner of devices, from phones and iPads and laptops and desktop computers, and certainly depending on the kind of examination that you need to do, some of those may or may not be better suited. So Greg, I'd love just your success factors. What would you recommend to people just to be mindful of as far as the setup, the environment goes for success?
Sure. Well, basically, I mean, it's fairly obvious. You've got what it looks like and what it sounds like, and then the software. So what it looks like what you look like. So obviously wearing something professional. We're working from home. You can't sit there in your t-shirt or your, Hawaiian shirt. Having something fairly plain, like all the participants here tonight have got plain shirts, because really bright shirts can throw the camera out and that sort of thing. The lighting, as Ralph was talking about as well, I've had to move my desk around because it's different for me during the day, whereas at night time I've got this light above my head and it, you know, shines off my lovely bald head. So all you would see is the light in the camera. So, the second thing is the sound, obviously testing your microphone, but also be mindful of other things either outside like traffic noise or screaming children, dogs, barking, those sorts of things, because they will come through quite loudly on your assessment. And then finally the software. I would recommend you get familiar with probably at least 3 different types of software, whether it's Zoom, CoView, GoToMeeting, WhatsApp. There's a whole lot of them around, and I'm not going to recommend one over the other, but I think you've got to have at least 2 or 3 up your sleeve, because as Sue said, I've had some one doesn't work and you've got to try something else, and yeah, you've got to be a bit nimble.
Certainly, and I know having spoken to quite a number of doctors who have now started doing video conferencing, your experience is pretty much the norm. So flexibility and getting familiar, I think, with a range of different software platforms is kind of the name of the game. And also we say getting familiar with it because obviously you don't want the tech to dominate the consult. You want to still be able to focus on the examination. We'll talk a lot more later about the different platforms that are around. Dominic, I'd like to throw to you, just in terms of the transition of going from usual face-to-face medico-legal assessments to doing these via video conference. How have you found the transition, and what impact has it had, do you think, on your ability to provide an effective report?
So full disclosure, the transition has been about 1 or 2 weeks. So we're not talking about a lot of consultations here. It has been reasonably challenging. Certainly they take longer, I find. The telehealth consult, you spend a lot more time at the beginning explaining the whole situation, obtaining consent, building that rapport. And of course, you're, as Ralph says, you want the worker to tell you sort of what's going on in their own words. You say no, cutting them off, things like that. So I found the transition sort of reasonably challenging. In terms of, doing the effective report, I think the report writing is sort of exactly the same. We can sort of try to compare, face-to-face consults and telehealth. And, if we take a step back and say, well, what are we trying to do? And we're trying to write a report which answers questions back to the referrer. And often these questions, given that we are doctors, are going to be focusing on things, could be treatment, could be, liability, work capacity. But the way that we approach that are all the same. We ultimately, number one, trying to get a diagnosis. We take a history, we do an examination, we look at investigations to get that diagnosis, and from there, everything else flows out. So if you look at, just say, like the history, telehealth versus face-to-face, pretty much the same. Maybe non-verbal cues might be slightly different, but they're pretty much the same. If you look at examination, face-to-face, telehealth, that's where the big difference is. And I think we'll talk about that a bit later on. And then if you look at investigations, compare the 2 media, again, pretty similar. You want to look at films on the screen, you can still look at the x-rays on the screens. You want to look at reports, you can still do the same. So I think, that's how I've looked at it as well. So, and then the report writing's the same.
Okay. All right. So let's start to look at some of those practicalities of conducting the assessments. And as you say, Dominic, this is, is new to everybody. Ralph, I know you've probably done 6 or 7 in the last 3 or 4 weeks. Greg's work is a little different, so he's very experienced with the technology and with doing examinations in New South Wales. But Ralph, just in terms of the practicalities of conducting a physical assessment via telehealth, actually, I'm going to ask you first, Greg. Do you know of any specific guidelines that are out there for medico-legal experts in terms of, making transitions and shifting the kinds of examinations? Is there anything out there that anyone can access right now?
I know we've got some on our website. We've got a whole lot of videos around, transitioning to telehealth. So, I think things like this that we're doing tonight, and also talking to your colleagues, I think it's also because no one's got I don't have all the answers, and I'm sure the panelists don't have all the answers either, but I think the more we share our knowledge, and I'm still learning things every day. I've been doing it for probably a year, and there's still things that come up that that I hadn't experienced before. So
yeah. So what are some, in terms of the examinations and things that you would normally do in a face-to-face assessment versus now video conferencing, what are some of the changes or shifts that you've had to make to still get the determinations, to make your determinations and feel confident in your decisions? What, from a physical assessment perspective, what are some of the changes you've made, Greg?
from physical assessments you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not easy. I'm not going to try and pretend that it's easy. Most of mine have been psychological. I've had a few physical ones, but it isn't easy. But yeah, it's improving with talking to people like this, and talking to our colleagues. But yeah, having enough room, like one of our ones we did last week with Todd, like having enough room to be able to come back and go, so that you can do a shoulder. Or see people's shoulder movements, or having their camera properly, so like using an iPhone, for example, so they can maybe look down at their ankle or those sorts of things. I think that's really important for physical assessments.
Great, thank you. And we've just had notice from Andrea. Thank you for submitting this in the chat function. The RACP have issued some telehealth guidance, a telehealth guidance document that's now available to all physicians. So thank you for letting us know and sharing that. That's the beauty of these kinds of seminars, that we can share the wealth and share information around what is actually available there. So thank you for sharing that. Ralph, I'd love to, or I'm sure we'd all love to hear about some of the things that you now do in a video conferenced assessment that, because you can't do them in a face-to-face. What are some of the modifications that you've made?
Oh, lots. Fundamentally, you have to be creative, and you've got to use lateral thinking. For instance, you can't test Tinel's sign and carpal tunnel syndrome, but you can do Phelan's and you can do reverse Phelan's. You've got to get the light correct sometimes. I saw a patient who'd had surgery at his lower thoracic level. Now, when he stood up and I had a look, there was too much light. I really couldn't even see the scar. So I got him to move the camera around, got him to move himself around. Actually, he had to move himself because there was no one else in the room, so that the light fell in an appropriate manner. Then I could see the scar quite clearly. And I could also see the paraspinal muscles, see if there's any spasm, wasting, etc. Got him to move a little bit further back and do a range of movement test. You can't do things like testing reflexes and establishing muscle power. But this is the point I was making about taking a detailed history. For instance, if the person has pain down the lateral leg, it's L5, the posterior leg, it's S1. You can work it out according to the dermatomal history the person gives you. If they can stand on their heels, then L4-5 is probably all right from a motor perspective. If they can stand on the tiptoes, L5-S1 is all right from a motor perspective. You can, again, can't test objectively sensory loss, but you can get the person to run their finger over one leg and one of the other and see if it's the same. Those kinds of things are important. And I think the other thing you've got to remember is, in occupational medicine, there are kind of two broad groups of assessments. There's the one which is done for work cover and similar institutions, where you're looking for liability, diagnosis, contribution, causation, treatment, and work capacity. Those are relatively straightforward, as Dominic was saying previously, if you take a very detailed history and get the person on your side. The more difficult ones I've found, and I've done a few of these, are fitness for duty assessments. Now that type of assessment requires a certain amount of speculation. It's quite different from the standard IME, which is based on evidence and what you glean from the history. When you have to speculate on, the usual question is, in your opinion, can this person return to their normal duties without any risk of aggravation or further injury for the foreseeable future? Now, nobody knows the answer to that. And you're always cautious when you do these assessments, even if you can examine the person. But if you can't examine the person, you're losing an important part of data for which you need to make such speculative assessments. In addition, sometimes you can't get radiology, and that again is another limitation. therefore, I think you've got to be far more cautious when you're making assessments which call for a degree of speculation than when you're making assessments which are based on evidence. And I think that's an important distinction to bear in mind. For the examination, you've just got to use a bit of nous. Like I saw a guy who had a knee injury, and this was in a boardroom. Fortunately, there's lots of room for him to move around. Got him to squat as far as he could. And then I got him to, I think it was his left knee that was affected, to turn the chair around so I could see the left knee carefully and gauge his range of movement. And then I got him to turn the chair around the other way so I could do the contralateral side and see the right knee movement. If a person's got an ankle injury and you're looking for valgus or varus, that's relatively easy. Just get them to stand still flat on their feet and you can tell. You can't measure it, but you can tell roughly whether the person's got that or not. So I think there are a lot of things that you can determine by using lateral thinking, and you've really got to do that. Otherwise, this whole process isn't going to work, and you're leaving yourself open to complaints, criticism, etc., etc.
Okay, thank you for that, Ralph. Dominic, how have you been modifying your examinations?
All right, so again, trying to be flexible and nimble, but I suppose what I was trying to think about was, you know, when you're comparing again the face-to-face to the telehealth examination, you know, with face-to-face, a lot of just say it's musculoskeletal, you know, I was taught you look, you feel, you move, you measure. So then you compare that, well, you know, telehealth look, well, that's, you know, we can do that pretty well, again, assuming the technology and the camera work is good. The feel's the big issue because you cannot feel and palpate, and so there's a lot of tools there you can't use. Move, so range of movement. So again, assuming that you can set up the camera and your patient the right way and watch that movement, then that's reasonable, but that tends to be active movement. You can't do the passive movement. And lastly, with measuring, it depends sort of what you're measuring. There are a few things you can and you can't. So as we said before, there are some limitations, and it's really that whole thing, whether you can work within that limitations to still get to the end road, which is the diagnosis.
Thanks, Dominic. I might actually just throw to you as well, Ralph, with just commenting a little bit on the issue of range of motion, and that's one of the questions that's been submitted live tonight, and certainly was submitted in the lead up to this webinar in the last week or so. And I know you've spoken to quite a lot of other doctors and orthopods, for example, around the issue of range of motion. Are there any other suggestions that you could share with our audience tonight around some strategies for determining range of motion that haven't yet been mentioned?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. And I think it's also different from us as physicians as against surgeons, because surgeons, from our experience, are a bit like engineers. They love to measure things, and you can't measure things here. Well, they try, and you can get around that as best you can. But you've just got to do what you can within your limitations. But the difficult part, and this is where a lot of clinical nous is required, is to extrapolate from your limited examination findings to determine, as Dominic said, a diagnosis first, and then all the other questions that are asked regarding causation, work capacity, treatment, etc. The thing that's important, I think, in all of this is to determine your list of questions and what you're meant to be doing. And I think it's a good idea to convey that to the patient so they know that what you're asking them to do and why you're doing it. You've really got to get as good a cooperation as you can from the patient. And the only way to do that is being pleasant, treating them with respect, more so than you normally would, and takes such a detailed history. It's very important. I remember going to a conference once where a lawyer said, as a plaintiff lawyer, Karina, that the first thing he looks for in an IME report is how detailed the occupational history is. And I think that's a really good point, because if you don't understand the person's occupation, you can't answer any of the questions. So I know I'm harping on this, but it gets back to really taking a detailed and accurate history. And I think that's the key to all of this.
Thank you, Ralph. And do you have any suggestions, Ralph?
One other thing. I think what we look for here is consistency, you know, between the history, the examination findings, which are limited, and the radiology and all that's given. So you've got to try and do that consistency, which is what we normally do anyway,
Yeah.
but it becomes more so in this circumstance. Sorry, that's enough.
That's okay, that's okay. And look, I'd like to thank all the participants for the questions coming in. I am watching these, and there's been some fantastic questions, and I have got those, and we're going to be coming to some of those sections. So please hang in there around questions around security of platforms and patient consent and so on. But we've had a fantastic question here that's come in, and you know, I'm actually just going to throw it to the panel, and whoever would like to answer this is welcome to, and that is, how can the examiner determine if cervical and or lumbar radiculopathy is present?
Oh, that's fairly easy. You'd take an accurate history of exactly where the pain goes, how they can function with the hand or the leg, and just use deduction.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree, Dominic?
So we're talking about radiculopathy in an impairment assessment thing, or in other forms of diagnoses? Because again, the history gives you some, but one thing which is lacking is the examination. You would be looking for reflex changes, but then again, you might get a nerve conduction study, which might give you some information about the nerve function. And that's one thing when we come to the, you know, if we're talking about impairment assessment, is that's where some of the challenges occur, because in Victoria we talk about AMA4, and AMA4, you know, often for spinal examinations we talk about the DREs and getting a diagnosis-based estimate. And one of the differentiators is to do with reflexes, and we can't do the reflex, but again, you could probably overcome that if you had a nerve conduction study showing something. So yes, I mean, you probably could say, you know, you've got clinical signs, or, you know, got clinical features suggestive of that. But without the reflexes, yeah, I agree, you know, there can be challenges there to confidently make that diagnosis.
And we're very soon getting onto the issue of impairment ratings and reliability of those, because I know it's very much a hot question on everyone's lips. Another question though, before we move on to that's been submitted is, again, I'll throw to the broad panel, how much can you, or do you, rely on the documented previous examination findings?
This is by other IMEs, you mean?
Yep, and through the through any previous IMEs, through treating doctors, through imaging, etc.
I think it's very important, because you can't do that yourself, so you've got to refer to what other people have done, but you've got to make mention of that in your report. I saw a patient last week or the week before, and I was very fortunate because just before the shutdown, he was from the country. He'd been asked to come into Melbourne, saw an orthopaedic surgeon who'd done a very detailed, beautiful examination. It was lovely. So I could refer to that, but we're not often that lucky.
Dominic, have you got any views on that?
So, I mean, yes, I mean, it gives you a snapshot in time of what their findings were. It really comes down to whether it's going to help you in the actual answering of your questions, or whether it's going to help you in making that diagnosis. So yes, we take all things into account, as we should when we're given documents and clinical examination findings and other investigations. We take everything into account to make our own decision currently when we're with the patient, the worker, and then we make our own decision about answering the questions. But yes, you take that into account in some way.
Okay, so we're going to move on now to this question of whole person impairment, and certainly the question that was asked before around radiculopathy has been clarified is around impairment, and this is a very common question that's submitted. You know, we've had many of these questions submitted in the last week and tonight as well, because the question is really, via video conferencing, do you think it is actually possible to do a reliable impairment assessment via video conference? Now I'm going to ask our doctors first, and then I'm going to ask Karina from a legal perspective as well, in that how will the courts view it, and where do we go, given that these are, you know, special consideration times. We're in a very unusual circumstance, and we're doing now, you know, things that we never would have envisaged doing 3 or 4 weeks ago. So I'm going to ask firstly again, Dominic, you know, what is your view? Can we possibly do impairment assessments that are reliable? Are there some that are more reliable than others? What's your perspective on this? And bearing in mind, this is a moving feast.
So I haven't done one yet, but I've had to think about it. And, you know, we do a lot of these at the medical panels, the impairment assessments, and this is again AMA4. So again, if you're other jurisdictions, I apologise, I don't know the other AMAs, 5, 6s, whatever. It really comes down to the region, and it's like on a case-by-case thing. So we look at impairment assessments for predominantly upper limb conditions, just say like a shoulder. The impairment assessment is predominantly a range of movement with a goniometer, because that's what they stipulate. So we just follow that. And again, range of movement, I think, is reasonable for us to do by telehealth. If we're looking at the spine, now the spine, you know, we often will do DRE, and when we do DREs, we look at the differentiators, and some of the differentiators we can do by telehealth, so maybe dysmetria of the nerve conduction tests, things like that, but others we can't. So maybe I would throw this to Karina afterwards to comment, is whether we could give a range. This could be a DRE 2 or 3, or it's a minimum of 2 or something along those lines, and we would then reassess someone, you know, maybe in 6 months' time or whenever we're allowed to do face-to-face. And then if there's lower limb is reasonably challenging, because there's about 10 different ways you can assess the lower limb. And with the lower limb, yes, some of those ways can be done by telehealth. Like if you do lower limb, the arthritis, then arthritis is a weight-bearing X-ray. You know, we can, but then some other things we can't do. So manual muscle testing for power and whatever. So it's a case-by-case thing, and maybe again would be interesting to see, can we just do our best guess, and not best guess, but this is what we're able to do. These are our limitations. Therefore, based on that, it's between this level and that level, or is it best to do a bit and come back in 6 months' time, or just even defer it for 6 months? But then again, we don't want to delay the process either. So interesting to hear Karina's view.
And look, I'm going to actually go to Karina next, but I think, you know, these are all such valid questions. And as we saw, even at the very first question of the evening, what are the regulators saying? And, you know, even Sarah's saying, well, you know, it's changing. Here's where we're going. You know, you look at the psych assessments, they're really putting it on hold for a week for the psych ones until the 22nd of May for the physical assessments. So it's all, everyone's finding out the ground now and working out where to go from here. So it's a very difficult one. I think it's clear to say that there's no definite answer to that, and that as we progress through this, we're going to start to learn different ways of being more confident with different impairment assessments and which ones can and can't be done. But I love it when Karina answers this question, because she comes at it from a legal perspective and kind of puts things in a great balance in terms of, this is the sector, this is what we're being asked to do, and given all the challenges, here's my thoughts. Karina, I'd love to hear your view on this.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Sue. So basically I agree with Dominic. It is a case-by-case basis. So nobody's saying that you should be doing reports that you don't stand behind. And that's not something that I would recommend, or anyone on the panel, I'm sure. I think we need to look at it in a different way. So what I've always said to many of the medico-legal doctors and IMEs is that we've been disputing your reports from day one. So it's not a new thing. It's even if it was in person or if it was via telehealth, I wouldn't be in litigation constantly every day if the reports were disputed. So we are on a level playing field, and I've used this term quite a lot. And what I mean by that is that the reports will both be normally done by telehealth, because there's a real movement towards not face-to-face. And if CIRA is saying, well, we're going to move to telehealth as well, then they're going to have the same challenges that each of you have, or anyone listening will have, in terms of what they can assess and what they cannot assess. So my view is that, yes, we need to do the best we can. And I have had reports, even when it was done in a physical, that have said that it is over a percentage rather than giving an actual percentage because of some factors that was a little bit different. I didn't mind so much because it was a threshold issue for me. So I wanted them over a threshold, and that indicated that they were over the threshold, and therefore they then took on the next statutory rights.
Okay, so I guess it's the message is do what you can, document what you can't. And I guess that's the other thing, you know, no one, as you said, no one is expecting anybody to say things that they're not comfortable in saying, and the message is to, at the moment, given the circumstances, comment on what you can comment on and what you can't make note of as well. And we're going to talk about things that should and shouldn't be in the reports as well, and touching on consent forms, but basically in terms of acknowledging that the assessment has been conducted by video conferencing and commenting on the things that you can confidently give your decision on. Now, Dominic, how would you respond to those who may say that Karina's view represents one of a plaintiff lawyer and isn't representative of the broader legal cohort? And I know that there'd be nobody here tonight at all who would think that, but just playing devil's advocate.
I mean, I've had a chat to a few lawyers just when I got asked to have it be part of this panel, mostly defendant, but also plaintiff. We had a same consistent message as Karina, really, is that do the best you can. You know, the process isn't going to stop. They accept that telehealth has limitations, but they feel that they're limitations which can be overcome. They're pretty comfortable with the process as long as we explain ourselves as to how we got to the diagnosis, on what things we based it on, and therefore what were the answers to the questions, which we may or may not be able to answer. Mm-hmm. They said that if there were particular issues, they could always rely on that report and send the worker back for a follow-up face-to-face assessment to confirm aspects of the report afterwards. So they were pretty comfortable given the limitations, and you know, we just have to do something. Doing something is better than doing zero, I think was sort of the take-home message I got from the various lawyers.
Great. Okay, and I've got a comment that's been submitted from one of our doctors tonight from Queensland, and the comment is that at the present time, and this is just for FYI for everybody here tonight, that WorkCover Queensland are not allowing assessments of permanent impairment. Sorry, just a moment. Not allowing assessments of permanent impairment for physical conditions by telehealth because of the marked limitations imposed by the lack of a physical examination. If a face-to-face can't be arranged, the PI assessment is being deferred in Queensland except in limited circumstances. So, you know, it's great that there's actually been a clear call to action in Queensland and clear guideline in terms of setting expectations in Queensland. So thank you for submitting that. I think certainly in other states there are different messages that are coming through. So, you know, tonight it's very much about sharing the wealth and helping all of our medical experts to come up to speed for the states and schemes in which they operate as quickly as possible. So if anyone on the webinar tonight has further information, please feel free to add it. I'm also just going to quickly take a segue and just refer people to the chat section, because there was some feedback around RACP guidelines, and there's a link that's now been included on the chat. So thank you for submitting that. Now I've got before we move on from the impairment issue, I've got a bit of a curly question again, firstly for Dominic and then for Karina. And that question is, what about the scenario where one side gets a face-to-face assessment done and the other does the assessment via video conference? Dominic.
I thought I might ask Karina first. I mean, because we are the provider, but I suppose as the referrer, what do you prefer?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. So basically, it happens anyway. I think we need to be really mindful of some things have already been happening. So I get reports and they've never seen the client, and they've made certain remarks about capacity and liability and all sorts of things. So I'm very quick to jump at that and say, well, very interesting enough, you haven't actually seen my client, and therefore there's no weight to the report. However, when we come to this is very unprecedented times. So it's not where we were previously, where I would probably dispute a telehealth. I was probably very, well, if you haven't seen my client in person, how can you actually get a true indication of the range of motion, the flexion, all of those sorts of things. But now that we've got the opportunity to sort of trial some of this, I'm actually quite excited about trialing some of the platforms and different ways of doing it for remote clients and clients that maybe can't travel or have those limitations. This may be an option for them. There's no limitation, I think, so long as the report is well weighted in terms of the backing and evidence and how you came to that conclusion. If you come to that conclusion based on very strong sort of information or evidence-based, then there's no difference in my mind between a telehealth and a physical. However, if you then had a physical report and it did raise some things that you hadn't previously dealt with, you could either get a supplementary report, or alternatively, as you said, Dominic, it may be one of those ones that falls into a, look, we're going to have a face-to-face, and unfortunately we are going to have to delay it until we can actually have a face-to-face. I know there's still a lot of doctors doing face-to-face still at this time. It's just a personal preference and really a work health and safety recommendation from World Health Organization to sort of reduce the face-to-face. And I think Greg said he was still doing some face-to-face consultations. So I think maybe in that situation, there would be a possibility of a face-to-face because it would fall outside of the norm.
Okay, and I know you've always said, Karina, that, really it's really about the evidence that you have put behind your opinion and making sure that it's as clear and detailed as possible, that I came to my decision because based on these things, this is why I think what I have. So having the evidence behind it. Dominic, I'm going to go to you in just a moment, but I wanted to raise a couple of questions as well that have come in, or a few points that have come in. And one of them is regarding range of movement, I should say. And that is that there is some research that shows that doctors have been able to, or are able to, accurately estimate range of movement in degrees without a goniometer. So we'll try and source that research and send that through to our attendees tonight. And a question again for you, Karina, and that is that some providers are getting allied health providers to do the physical examination. And would this be preferable to no exam or just a passive range of motion? So what's your view on if you can do that? I guess, I guess it depends on if you're given a complete social isolation kind of scenario versus where someone does go and see allied health. Is that better, more reliable, less likely to be disputed if you had an allied health to support you with that?
It's hard to say, I think, because it's case by case. If there's something in a report that is unsubstantiated or not backed, then you may need to go to the allied health and move that past that sort of point, because we don't necessarily as lawyers look at it from a scientific point of view. We look at it from a legal point of view, which is sometimes a bit of a bridge or difficulty between doctors and lawyers, because if you don't do the type of medico-legal work on a regular basis, or you're new to it, the scientific part of it is, by all means, I love it because I love the medical space, but we don't necessarily need all of that. We just need you to satisfy the criteria from a legal perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I could just make a comment, and thank you, Trish, for the comment about the, so this is, I think, I'm guessing what she's talking about was you do a telehealth assessment with the worker, and an allied health practitioner goes and spends time with the patient and does the examination. And I suppose if you're doing telehealth for social isolation and distancing reasons, then you're still introducing a person for the worker who's going to be interacting with them. So you're still, you shouldn't, if you're going to be doing the total social isolation in separate rooms, then we really shouldn't be having another person, a third person, being involved with examining the worker if it's for that reason. That's all I would comment on.
Yeah, and it could be just for maybe, and I'm just hoping I'm answering this question correctly, possibly if there is some type of testing that you feel you can't do, which would only take a small period of time, and you carry out the proper requirements to protect yourself and to protect the worker, then maybe, that could be an option. But again, Dominic, I do agree with you. Unless you absolutely necessarily need a face-to-face, then I would just do it via telehealth.
Can I ask a question there? First of all, I don't like the term allied health practitioner. I mean, it can be anybody from a herbalist to a surgeon. Who are you referring to specifically, Dominic? Physios, chiros, that sort of thing? Or?
Yeah, I've certainly heard of, so when you're doing an IME, the worker is with, it could be a nurse, it could be a physio, it could be an OT, someone who is being, so for example, you would ask that the nurse in the room with the worker say, could you please check the reflexes, or can you move the shoulder, or do whatever. So there's another person with so doing the examination on sort of your behalf.
Yeah, I've never done anything like that because I think you lose a certain amount of credibility. And if you think about it, the purpose of you doing an assessment, as well as doing what's requested, is to ensure that your assessment is not challenged. Now, if you're abrogated some of the task to a non-medical person, I think you're opening yourself to a huge amount of challenge. Would you agree, Karina?
I think that it would, it could cause difficulties if it's, so for instance, if it was, I think I read there it was a physio scenario, it could cause difficulties because the physio's opinion versus an orthopedic opinion could be completely different, and they could actually conflict with each other and cause some issues. If you're going to do an assessment, I think you're better off just to do it with one practitioner, and then if it's on that case, it's you can't conclude a certain question, or there's some questions you can't do, then you should just delay and wait until you can actually deal with it.
And the other aspect of that question is you're not doing the face-to-face thing because you're worried about safety. Shouldn't the other practitioner have the same concerns? I don't know. That's a very realistic scenario. That's what I'm getting at.
And the worker. I have actually,
exactly.
the situation is that we don't want to be, putting our workers in a situation of risk. And then with safe work, it's a huge issue whether or not the person that's actually seeing them is compliant with the social distancing and hygiene and all that sort of thing. So you lose control of that because it's not with you.
Yeah, I agree.
So look, there's been quite a lot of, this is obviously a very big topic, and there's been a lot of variations on themes of the questions coming through. So scenarios like doing the history via telehealth and then a subsequent 15-minute clinical-based examination, which was kind of what you were talking about before. Is it about complete, distancing where people should actually be remaining in their own homes as opposed to having another person come. And then there's also been questions around, well, if you're still going to distance, are there certain viewpoints around, is it better to have the person still come to some location, or is it better to do it at home? And Greg, I'm going to throw to you for these kinds of considerations. So looking at scenarios of, would you actually send them to a consulting room even though they were isolated, or continue to do it at home? But also looking at scenarios where the person is at home and they may have a husband, a wife, somebody else in the home that could be a support person, and I don't mean from an emotional support, but who could potentially help you with some of the examination, A, do you think it's appropriate? B, when do you think it's appropriate? And are there any, I guess, ethical considerations around that in terms of at an appropriate time bringing in or asking the examinee to have somebody available to help with a particular aspect of the examination? Greg, could you comment on a range of those areas that have come in?
Well, first of all, about them coming into a certain location, I think we're either isolating ourselves or we're not. So unless it's something, I mean, Karina might be able to give some examples. I can't think of it. Unless there's something really super urgent that needs to be done physically, I can't see why you would be doing it. You either do it via telehealth, or if Queensland says you can't do it until it's all over, well, then you can't do it till it's all over. In terms of having somebody else in the room, like a family member, I think certain circumstances, it could be helpful, mainly for having the camera. Like if they're on an iPhone, then you've got someone else who can, move it into different angles and say, okay, we'll bend over here, or can you zoom in on their ankle, or can you measure, you can get them to measure, muscle and its circumference. Again, it's not perfect, but you'll get, it's better than not being able to do it at all. And if they're a family member, well, they're not socially isolating anyway, so that I don't think the ethical thing. I had a problem with, the previous thing about getting somebody else to do the exam. It's like, oh, well, you can get infected instead of me, Yeah,
for sure. Ralph, what's your view on this? I know I've asked you this question before.
Well, I tend to agree with Greg. I think we're talking about risk here, and you have to quantify risk, of course, and relative risk and so on. But you can't abrogate responsibility to do part of the examination to a non-qualified person. And I'm talking about the qualified person who's been asked to do the assessment is the doctor. It's not being asked of a physiotherapist, a nurse, whatever. I think that's really dangerous, having people like that assisting with the examination. In one of the previous webinars, one of the doctors mentioned that he uses a family member to palpate joints and things like that. And I think that also creates problems. You can get the patient to press on various areas and tell you if it's sore or not. It's not a very sharp tool, but it's all you've got. And I think you've just got to be as creative as you can. But the ultimate thing is safety, I don't know if Dominic and Greg have had the same experience, but I stopped seeing patients in my office in the city on the 26th of March because I had 5 patients booked in that morning. None of them turned up. And it's pretty obvious why they didn't, because everybody's terrified to get out of their house. So you've got to bear all these things in mind, and telehealth is a real boon because, for one thing, it keeps us working, which is rather nice. But otherwise,
and it helps the personal injury sector moving through too.
Yeah, exactly. So there are a lot of benefits, and you can actually do the job, I think, quite satisfactorily within certain limitations. I really don't think you can do range of movement testing accurately with telehealth. Look at the hand, for instance. Say somebody's got a hand injury. Now, you can't do range of movement without a goniometer, and even then it's difficult. And you can't test sensory loss. You can't look for muscle wasting, things like that. So I think there are limitations in doing impairment assessments, and I think the Queensland government's probably made the right step. I think the only thing you can do in impairment assessments is DREs. And as Dominic pointed out before, there are difficulties there too. But you've got to remember that there's quite a wide overlap between the different categories for any particular injury. And that gives you a bit of a leeway in terms of your recommendations.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of conversation on this in the chat and the questions. And again, I thank everybody for this. And I think, and Karina, I might just throw to you for one last viewpoint on that. But I think what we're hearing is that generally getting others to be involved in helping do the assessment is not a particularly good idea. There may be some merit there in helping them from a holding cameras potentially, or helping them move into a right position. And there's been a comment as well about from the Australian Journal of Physiotherapy about the reliability of friends for assessing range of motion. So if the person who popped that in, oh, hang on, 5 friends. Sorry, I'm not quite following what the feedback is. So, Karina, if you could mention what that is again, that would be great. And I would just recommend people to check out the chat box. There's some fantastic things that are being listed here. And I also wanted to touch base on the viewpoint of a lot of the people putting in the chat around having, say, an allied health is basically a similar viewpoint that, you know, it's just exposing another person and it's probably defeating the purpose of social isolation is generally a viewpoint. Also, another fantastic comment raised about having an individual in the room helping with the assessment, and that is around, I guess, coercion and being, so comment about partner could be controlling, the relationship could be abusive, and that the person may not feel comfortable answering certain questions. So I guess these are all valid points that have been raised, not only tonight, but in other circumstances as well. Karina, did you have a final word on your view from a legal perspective of if there was a second person, a family member who was also in the home, in terms of helping with the examination from a legal perspective?
Yeah, I think that it would affect the weight of the report. I think that you probably could use that person for, as you said, you know, holding the camera, or if they need to stand up against a wall for a certain assessment and someone's got the camera down low. I have heard of people ordering music stands in order to have the camera sitting there so that they can actually do the assessment better, turn around, have it low, have it high, because it's very difficult to sort of hold a camera and do the motion at the same time. So I think if they're doing that, or maybe if they're holding a tape measure or something that they're not actually conducting the assessment as such, they're just an aid in terms of maybe holding the tape measure that you can cite and say, I saw the tape measure was held by such and such, and I could see on the tape measure that it read blah, blah centimetres. So you can back up your evidence with it, then I think it's fine, but I don't think we should be necessarily, they're not qualified, they're not doctors, and I don't think we should be putting any sort of weight on any examination by them.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, before we're gonna move on to looking at the tech, I'm looking at time, and fantastic questions as mentioned. Any that we don't get to, I'll answer afterwards. And I just wanted to call out and thank you, Karina, for clarifying. In the Australian Journal of Physiotherapy 2001, there is an article called "Reliability of 5 Methods of Assessing Shoulder Range of Motion." Range of motion is such a common, frequent question. How do we do this? And it sounds like there could be a good resource there that I'd like to direct you all to. So thank you, Karina, for clarifying that resource. All right, now we're going to look at telehealth platforms. We're going to look at the issue of security. We're going to look at the issue of privacy. And I thank you for the patience of one of our lovely participants who probably asked the first question. She's finally now getting answered, and that is there a legal implication regarding the software that's chosen? For example, secure, encrypted web conferencing software versus free public software like Zoom or Skype? And this is a fantastic question because the issue around the tech to use is a little bit of a minefield. Now, I'm going to cover that off. That's mine. So, and a fantastic question, because medico-legal telehealth assessments are indeed considered a health service where health information is collected and stored. So like your medical documentation, like anything else that you have, your telehealth consults also need to meet Australian Privacy Act requirements, which means you need to take all reasonable steps to protect information from misuse, from loss, from interference, from modification, etc. And given the many kinds of telehealth platforms that are available, I mean, even in this question, there's been, 4 different different examples provided about different kinds of software that's out there, you know, do you need to consider that? And are you legally implicated? And I guess the short answer is, well, yes, you are responsible in terms of the software that you use to ensure the privacy of the health record. So the transaction or the consultation is what I meant to say. So this also, I just would like to flag, doesn't just relate to the conducting of a telehealth assessment. Now that many of you are also working from home, it also pertains to your document collection and your document storage. You know, how are you receiving your patient information? Is it via email? Is it via fax? Is it still via mail? I mean, the RACGP has been a strong advocate for the use of secure electronic communication across the healthcare sector, because confidential information does end up in the wrong hands, unfortunately, and the penalties can be quite large. You're probably all quite familiar as an individual. Breaches in privacy can be, as an individual, for $340,000. Corporations, $1.7 million. And while to date we haven't really seen many fines applied, particularly not to individuals, there has been a ripple effect of this maintaining privacy in the medico-legal arena, where you now have the scenario where financial institutions like Commonwealth Bank and Westpac, government agents, superannuation companies, as a result of the 2017 Royal Commission into misconduct in the financial sector, has now mandated that they can only transact or only provide work to medico-legal doctors who are using a secure encrypted platform for the storage and collection of health records. So it's the same for documents and storage of health records as it is for medico-legal assessments and video conferencing software. It is a bit of a minefield. I'm going to talk about the video conferencing software, but I will also just say on the MEDirect website, under the tab for medical experts and transitioning to telehealth, there is a guide that compares the whole range of video conferencing platforms that are out there. So it compares it in terms of how they work, in terms of costs, in terms of packages, in terms of all of those kinds of things. And I'd recommend, if you're still trying to work out what to do and where to go, to have a look at that resource. And I'd also just like to reiterate that the MEDirect practice management system, of course, meets all privacy requirements. I'm going to do a very quick top line of the different kinds of platforms that are out there, and also touch on this question around security. So there are two main types of video conferencing software out there. There's the older Skype technology, which requires that you and your examinee download an app, that you set up an account, and that you then exchange your account details. Then there are the newer cloud-based kinds of software, like CoView, which is an Australian innovation out of the CSIRO. There's GoToMeeting, there's Zoom, there's JoinMe, there's Doxy.me, and even WhatsApp would be considered as part of that kind of package of cloud-based servers. Now, let's talk about Skype. Many of the medical colleges still mention Skype as an option for video conferencing. Personally, I don't really like it, because you do need to exchange Skype addresses, which means that after you've done the assessment, the examinee still could continue to call you or message you. I know many practices just set up their own practice address to try and minimize that. But the way that Skype works is a little bit like a telephone. At any time, once the other person has your address, they can contact you through that. And that cannot happen through the cloud-based options that are around. I think Skype as well, from what I have read, does have a bit of a backdoor, and where you have a one that's backdoor, it does enable, it means it's easier for hackers to get into. So my understanding is that it isn't as secure as others on the market. And I guess from a practical perspective as well, you've got to look at, if you are using Skype, you need to ask the individual to download the app to set up set up their own account. And there may be limitations around that in terms of, do they speak English? How tech savvy are they? What equipment do they have? And Greg's going to touch on this in a moment. Now, the way the cloud-based platforms like CoView, like DoxyMe, the way they work is that there are indeed some free ones. I know DoxyMe has a very good free package, and it is secure end-to-end encrypted, and that is what you need to look for, secure end-to-end encryption. CoView is also secure end-to-end encrypted, and what this means is that people can't hack into it. There are some free versions of DoxyMe. I think CoView is sitting at about $25 a month for that service, and those two are designed for doctors, meaning it looks like a medical consulting room, meaning you can also do consent forms via the platform, meaning you can exchange imaging and other documentations, and once the examination is completed, the record is destroyed. So there is no way for that to linger on. So it's those two platforms are very secure. GoToMeeting, Join Me are also secure. Zoom, I want to talk about. Zoom's had a lot of trouble over the last few months, and particularly in the last 2 weeks. Any of you who may have been using Zoom might have come across some of the issues that are there. Now, I'm not going to recommend or otherwise your use of any of the platforms, because indeed none of the colleges, none of the regulators, Medicare is not even recommending a certain platform, neither is the Digital Health Agency. So it makes it very difficult for you who are trying to maintain privacy. But my understanding of Zoom is that when they say secure end-to-end encrypted, they're not referring to the same thing that everybody else is. And I've got a fantastic article that talks about some of the leniencies that Zoom may have taken in terms of their scenarios around security, to the degree that they've been quoted as saying that they have favoured ease of use over privacy and over security. So I'll just alert you to that. I know that they have put in a password patch over the last week that prevents other people joining. I think, I know Greg's certainly had some people join in on a lay kind of conversation that he was having, and I know some of the other doctors have. I do believe they've put a patch over it, but I guess the message that I'm saying is, do your due diligence, because again, there are no set recommendations. There are no platforms that anybody is mandating out there. And I do think it is, again, a moving feast. The software is moving so very quickly. My take home would be that when you are choosing your software, to choose a software that you're comfortable, first and foremost, you're comfortable using, that you know how to use, that you can use without a lot of trouble. And I'd also recommend that you use get to know several different platforms. So that's a start. There is a lot more, as I've said, on the website for you to have a look at. But it is there is no recommendation. Nobody's saying what to use and what not to use. But yes, there is the onus on you to use something that is secure and encrypted. And that really comes down to you as to what you're reading. My recommendation would be CoView, DoxyMe. They're the ones that I would probably say are the most secure. Greg, I'd like to throw to you though, in terms of your experiences of ease of use with platforms. What's your experience been with people who are on the other end, examiners on the other end, and how that influences your choice of technology?
Yes, we could have a whole webinar just on this, but I think we have to remember who a lot of our patients, applicants, whatever you want to call them, are. Some of them, as you mentioned, English isn't their first language. A lot of them are older and don't understand technology. I've come across a lot of them who don't have a computer. Mm-hmm. So our tech guy suggested apps that you could use on your phone, because most people have a decent phone, which has a decent camera and a decent microphone in it. We've got some people using Windows 95 still on computers, so it's not going to run half these things. So I think that's really important. Yeah, just a quick thing about the Zoom. What you're referring to, wasn't a telehealth consultation. It was just catching up with a friend of mine. It finished, and about 15 seconds, there was just audio of these two girls discussing about some hot guy that they'd met, the week before. So probably don't want that on a telehealth consultation. So yeah, I think Zoom are still working out their privacy issues. I don't know if you've heard anything, Karina, with from the legal point of view.
Yeah, so we use Zoom at the moment, and they're moving to some different platforms through CIRA, I think. We haven't got to try them out yet. I'll have my first workers' compensation hearing, I think it's next week, and they're still trialling some virtual courts. So we are moving towards a virtual court. And as they're setting those up, they are having some difficulties with all of the platforms, not just one in particular. So I think the technology's there. It's just a matter of now protecting it. I think there will always be someone smarter as a hacker than any program will ever keep up. We had to install, I also lecture at the University of Wollongong, so I'm still teaching via Zoom. And they've actually, they use Zoom, but we had to put in a VPN and some password codes and things like that. So just trying to make sure that you protect as best you can, that you have all of that technology on your devices on your end, doesn't necessarily mean that the other person on their end won't get hacked from their side. So, yeah.
And I think the other thing I wanted to say is, test it out beforehand. If you're confident to do it, that's fine. I've actually started using a company called Telehealth Tech because my time's worth, too much. And I'm sure you're the same. By the time you're ringing people, emailing them backwards and forwards, and then they don't get back to you and all this sort of stuff. Because I've had a few disasters in the early days, so definitely I tested at least 24 hours before.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There are some companies out there that can help to concierge it for you so you don't have to do it, so that you can just turn up and focus on the assessment. So that's Telehealth Tech is one. Just a couple of questions as well about where is that document about comparing different platforms. It's on the MEDirect website, so MEDirect.com.au. That's our business. There is a whole section, actually I'll talk about it in just a moment, and I'll give you the link because there's a few resources out there that we've got available to you. So I'll come to that in just 1 minute. Now, just want to quickly cover off consent forms, and I might throw to Dominic on this one. And the question is, how do you handle consent forms via video conferencing? Certainly some of the platforms that we've mentioned tonight, like DoxyMe and CoView, you can actually send automated consent forms so that the person can electronically sign in advance. But Dominic, could you comment on consent forms for us, please?
Sure. I'll tell you what I do, and welcome feedback. So I send out an information sheet or like a consent form for the worker to read. Then at the start of my consultation, I go through that form with them. I ask them whether they consent, and then I document that in the report. That's what I currently do, and I'd be happy if anyone wants to tell me I'm not doing enough. But Karina, in particular, that's what I do currently for my first 5. So there you go.
Okay, now I'm just going to share my screen right now. There's been a couple of questions about where to find some of this information. What you're seeing right now is a URL to the MEDirect website. If you go to the tab called Medical Experts and one called Transitioning to Telehealth, you'll find a whole series of 24 video tutorials by yours truly, and I will just say some of these videos are as short as 30 seconds and just some very quick questions that we actually produced about 3 weeks ago, and everyone was just getting started with telehealth and had a lot of questions about what to do and what are some of the rules around things like recording them and consent forms and different kinds of text. So you'll find that document there comparing different tech platforms. Also wanted to mention, we have had quite a lot of requests for any patient information that can be handed out to individuals prior to an assessment. I'm not going to take credit for the document that you're going to see on the screen right now. It's actually an RACGP patient guideline that I identified, I saw, and I changed the words and some of the context around medico-legal. But this is also available for you as a Word document, so you can put your own colours and your own logos on it and hand that out to your examiners if you would like to. And I also finally want to make mention of this recording tonight, which will be made available on the ANZSOM website over the next couple of days. Now, we've had quite a lot of questions tonight, and we will answer as many as we can. And we've also had some suggestions around continuing the conversation around telehealth and providing ongoing opportunities to share the wealth of ideas and to put considerations before your peers. So I wanted to ask you and put a poll out to say, would you like to have an ongoing forum to discuss issues surrounding telehealth? And if so, how frequently would you like this to occur? Would you like it to be fortnightly? Would you like it to be monthly or 6 weekly? So I'm going to now just launch the poll and give you a moment to answer that. All right, so you should now see the poll. There's 2 questions there. Please just take a moment to let us know if you'd like to continue the conversation. Oh, wow, look at that, 100% so far. All right, we're about 70% have voted. Okay, around 82% have voted. I'm going to end the poll in just a minute. So what we are seeing, and I'm going to share the results with you right now, is pretty much everybody would like to continue this conversation. So thank you for that. And most people would like to have a conversation around this, maybe in some kind of chat forum, and submit your questions. Please let Dominic know, please let ANZSOM know, roughly on a monthly basis. So thank you so much for that. Now, so we come to the end of our evening, and I'd like to thank you all for your, for your participation, for your questions, for your chat. There's been some fantastic sharing of the wealth, some great editorials, some great resources shared, and we'll make that available as well after tonight. I'd like to just finish by thanking our panelists tonight. Thank you, Greg, Karina, Ralph, and Dominic, for sharing all your insights and for being the brave ones, given that it's still such early days, for being open to put your opinions forward. Thank you for sharing. And thank you as well, I guess, for Dominic and ANZSOM for having us here to do this webinar with you tonight. And I'd now just like to hand over to Dominic to close off tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Sue. And again, I hope all of you found that beneficial. Certainly help answer some of my, what if you go back to the, thank you again. Inside expertise by giving up your evening. It could have been watching Netflix or binge watching something. So thank you again. To all the ANZSOM members, again, we are planning to run more webinars in this socially distanced world. This is the way we're going to be connecting with each other. So please, if you've got ideas of what to do, let your branch know, let us know. We're happy to run more of these sessions. And hopefully, if all things go well, by November, as you know, the ANZSOM has postponed their annual scientific meeting, the Launceston meeting. So please save this date, November 19th to the 22nd. We're hoping to run that, well, we're hoping for it to run. We're pretty confident with the current numbers of COVID cases reducing, that could be on the cards, that we could be certainly doing interstate trips by then. So until then, please stay well, of course keep in touch, and good night.